Good morning. My name is Elisha and I'm a first-year PhD student studying Russian history at Georgetown University. I am here today with Georgetown Professor of Imperial Russian History, Greg Afinogenov. Professor Afinogenov holds a PhD in Russian history from Harvard University and a BA in history and philosophy from Fordham University. He is the editor and translator of Yermonk Feodosy Smorzenski's Notes on the Jesuits in China, which I understand is the first English publication of Smorzenski's account of the Jesuit mission in China. We now anticipate his upcoming book, Spies and Scholars, Clandestine Encounters Between Russia, China, and the West. Professor Afinogenov, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to talk to you.
The title of your upcoming book is quite intriguing. Could you provide listeners an overview of your book and the inspiration for this project?
Yeah, so the book is basically a study of Russian spies in China between the mid-17th and the mid-19th century. And it tries to look at the information that those spies produced, the intelligence that they produced, in a kind of a global framework, because it recognizes that it wasn't just Russians who were interested in stuff about China, it was all kinds of people who were taking information out of Russia as well. And so it looks at knowledge as something that circulates around the world and that has real-world effects in pretty significant ways, and often unexpected ones. So when I talk about clandestine encounters, what I really mean is not just espionage as we think of it, cloak and dagger kind of stuff, although that has its place as well, but all kinds of interactions that take place beneath the surface of public academic writing or scholarship, the kinds of things that we generally talk about when we think about sinology or European discourse about China, or Orientalism even. And the Spies and Scholars refers to the idea that what I'm tracking is the development of formal academic disciplinary scholarship about China out of the shell of intelligence gathering and espionage, which is not something not a connection that, at least in this context, we usually have the ability to trace.
You mentioned this flow of knowledge that circulates. Would you then say this work is in addition to the discourse of ongoing trends of transnational history?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that transnational history as such has a methodology, and I don't think it necessarily should. I think it's more of a mood or an approach to writing history. But I think I found it incredibly useful and in fact necessary to trace things as they move abroad, because we often don't pursue the books one step further. And we, for example, a classic example is that we study a lot of 18th century Russian literature that we think of as Russian literature, but in fact is translated and adapted versions of, for example, French books from the same period. So you need to follow those connections if you're going to actually write an adequate account of what you're trying to do.
Thank you for providing an excerpt chapter of this book entitled Imperial Encounters in the North Pacific. It was a great sampling of what's to come. And in this chapter, you focus on several individuals as key players. Would you say that this is a discussion of structure versus agency and emphasizing the agency of these individuals?
Yeah, so when it comes to books like this, I think it's often hard to figure out where the structure is and where the agency is, in part because 18th century Russia was a very personalized place. There were bureaucratic institutions with a bureaucratic ethos, as early as the 17th century. But what it really is in this case is a series of patronage networks, really, that are highly influenced by whoever is at the top and their peculiar individual preoccupations. So, and I think the structure part often comes in when people talk about this in a kind of a proto-international relations kind of way, as a rivalry between great powers and constructions of sort of national interest and all of these things, which, when you actually look at the events on the ground in the North Pacific, turn out to be to depend on extremely what we would think of as pretty bizarre pieces of intelligence gathered or even made up by people who these marginal actors who are middlemen in a global intelligence context that's very chaotic and not at all predictably governed by institutions or constructions of national interest.
Your discussion in this chapter in particular is very interesting with this idea of made-up threats and imagined threats. Can you tell how that maybe some challenges of a historian in tracing these imagined threats, which may in turn develop into real and actual threats in history?
Yeah, of course, many of us start out reading history and being immediately skeptical of the sources we encounter because we realize, look, so many of them are biased, or so many of them are, every source is biased to some extent. But that that they're produced by these self-interested actors. But when you're in their archives and you can never get the same kind of resolution about the stuff that the documents are talking about that the writers of the documents have, and so you often end up taking them at their word in terms of descriptions of a situation. And when you come to realize that actually they're just wrong a lot of the time, they just don't have all the information. They just are driven by conspiracy theory or paranoia or all of these constructions of threat, that you really need to start figuring out what is real here and what is not. And I think, so for me, for example, this episode with Binyovsky and the document that he forges from the Kamchatka Chancellery and then sells to the French crown, I think it's a very good example for me because it really shows that you can create a very convincing document that nobody in France will be able to doubt, but you as a historian actually do have the ability to say, look, this was completely bogus. And I think it was very helpful for me to be able to do that. But if I just encountered this document in a French archive without having done the preliminary research in Russia, I would have not been able to understand it at all.
Right, and can you speak more about developing this relationship of conspiracy between Britain, Russia, and France, and even the United States in your research process?
Yeah, so so of course I started out this project thinking that it would be transnational, but it became less transnational over time as I came to realize that the transnational parts of it did not need to be shoehorned in when they didn't fit, because it turned out that a lot of the things that I was learning about were in fact very much internal stories of rivalries between Russian institutions. And of course the challenge of doing archival research in multiple countries is that you really have to narrow your focus to a certain extent, because any kind of idea that I'm going to be studying France, Britain, the US and Russia equally, really, not only was it kind of empirically and materially unsustainable, it was also not good for my work, because I was specifically writing a history of Russia, I was not writing a history of France. And so I needed to sort of give everything its own proper place and decide how much I was going to devote to each particular area. So it was a real challenge, I think, to do that. But I did think it was necessary to insert myself into the perspectives of British and French actors as well, because looking at it from a Russian point of view, you often end up repeating traditional narratives about how Russia is paranoid, Russia is anxious about catching up with great powers, when really in the late 18th century everyone was thinking along these lines. Everyone was driven by these strange paranoid agendas.
That is an interesting perspective, and I am personally looking forward to the finished product. And my question to you is, what do you hope your readers will take away after reading this book?
I think what they'll take away is, I don't know, or I hope anyway, is that we need to pay attention to knowledge, and we need to pay attention to how knowledge is institutionalized, and how different forms of institutionalizing knowledge actually shape everything about the way a country works, especially from the point of view of foreign policy. Because, to move us away from these broad generalizations about national interest or great power rivalry to a more nuanced idea of how individuals fit into larger institutional structures, and how structures, even in the 18th century, were using different ideological language to make claims for state resources, endorsements of a particular policy line that they supported, and so forth. So I think in Russian history we tend to look at Enlightenment as a very sort of fetishized category of intellectual production, that's very French, very elite, very academic, and we don't look at this huge amount of work that was being done in institutions by people who didn't really think of themselves as scholars, but who nonetheless were creating knowledge on a pretty large scale. So I hope that people will come to realize just how much there is in the Russian archives of, properly speaking, intellectual history, which I don't think most people realize.
This interest in knowledge seems to be a theme in your professional career and interests throughout your previous publications. Can you speak to what got you interested in that in general, not just from this book project, but before? Yeah,
I think doing a degree in history and philosophy at the same time sort of helped me sharpen this a bit, because I took a lot of courses with a professor named Babbage at Fordham, who's a Nietzsche scholar, and it really made me think a lot about the way that intellectuals think about what they do and how they formulate their ideas about what their role in society is, I guess. And so as I started to I wrote a senior thesis in college about Habermas and the New York public sphere, and it was kind of like very clear that people were driven by these very exalted ideas of what they were doing, when you could look at the stuff that they wrote and very clearly trace the material underpinnings of what they did. So to me, it's kind of I want to demystify intellectuals on the one hand, but I also want to see how complex the category of intellectual is in societies that perhaps are not like the 20th century and are not like the familiar elite drawing rooms that we're familiar with when it comes to intellectual history.
And can you further expand on how this process led you to the pursuit of particularly the role of Jesuits in not only Russian history but in your larger historical work projects that you've accomplished?
Yeah. So the Jesuits, it's interesting. I mean, this project started with the Jesuits because I'd gone into a Russian archive in St. Petersburg and I'd discovered a file of correspondence between Russian academics and Jesuits in Beijing. And reading these letters, the way that they spoke of this exchange was in some ways very similar to the way academics now think of Jesuit academic exchange as something kind of representing early modern globalization, as something being, very. I mean, obviously they didn't use this language, but they talked about it as the noblest commerce, right? This commerce of ideas. They loved to write to each other about how great it was that they were corresponding at such long distances, and it was the self-consciousness of this that I think attracted me to this, and the fact that you often see the Jesuits talked up as representatives of globalization in a lot of ways, but you don't really see the kind of alliances that they were forced to make or the ways in which other kinds of intellectual structures played into this. And I think Russia and China are an interesting case because Russian policymakers really idealized the Jesuits. They really thought, look, the Jesuits have all this access to the imperial court. If we can only create a Jesuit mission of our own, in fact, Georgetown University was founded or was survived in part as a result of an off branch of one of these Russian projects to create a Russian mission, a Jesuit mission in Beijing. Long story. But the fact that they were themselves so fascinated with this idea of the Jesuits as these global actors, these global intellectual players, was, I think, something really worth exploring.
Right, and in the chapter that I read as a part of excerpt of your book, you mentioned that the Russian approach towards the Jesuits was unique and different compared to the larger community. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the Russians were much more instrumental when it came to the Jesuits. Because on the one hand they were driven by this idea of the Jesuits as having a lot of influence, but of course they didn't have any sympathy for the religious mission of the Jesuits whatsoever. And in fact, for the most part, in the 18th century they weren't particularly driven by religious goals, but they certainly didn't have any sympathy for Catholicism as a project, right? So, and yet nevertheless, because of the strange situation in which Russia ended up being the sole protector of the Jesuits around the world after the society was abolished, they ended up in the situation where they were able to instrumentally use the Jesuits to achieve very specific foreign policy ends, which is how you get these attempts to use them as spies or to use them to push particular policy agendas in Beijing, which I thought was an interesting story. Yeah.
Before we move on from this topic, I think your listeners would be very interested to hear just a little about the Georgetown connection that you mentioned.
Okay, so in 1792, 1793, Britain sent the Macartney embassy to China. As you know, it failed. And Russia learned about the Macartney embassy very early before it set sail, and already at that point they started to hatch a plan to send another embassy of their own to China to sort of say look, we're better than the English, and in fact we'll protect you from British imperialism. And so they put this together. It doesn't succeed, but then finally, a decade later, under Alexander I in 1805, they do send another embassy to China, which actually doesn't end up getting much past the Mongolian border. And the other component of that embassy was supposed to be a party of Jesuits who travels through Lisbon, because remember that China at this point is still within the limits of the Portuguese Padroado, and so they have to travel through Lisbon due to the regulations of the church. And so they're supposed to travel to Lisbon and sort of deliver a letter to the Jesuits, to the remaining handful of Jesuits in China, to say, look, Russia's going to be your new patron now. It's going to provide you with all the scientific instruments and money you need, and so forth. So unfortunately, they're not able to get out of Lisbon. Nobody is willing to send them on a ship because there's just been a persecution of Catholics in China, and so nobody wants to risk it. So they spend about 5 or 6 years traveling around Europe and just looking for some way to go to China. And eventually the mission collapses, and basically it's 3 or 4 Jesuits, one of whom is Giovanni Grassi. And so eventually they basically cancel the mission, and Grassi ends up going to Georgetown, where he becomes the president of Georgetown in, I think, 1812. And Georgetown at this point is in dire financial straits. It's about to close. Like it seems it's running out of money, et cetera. And Grassi puts in place a bunch of policies that sort of rescue it from financial collapse and build it up as a real institution. But Grassi had been, an employee of the Russian state up until that point for over a decade. So
that is quite interesting. And looking at your career so far, would you be able to speak on your favorite research project to date?
Huh. I think following the trail of this Binyovsky thing was the most exhilarating thing I think that's ever happened to me, because what happened essentially is I picked up a little bit on this in Russia and I didn't really know what to do with it. And then I went to the French Archive of Foreign Affairs outside of Paris, and I came upon this, this like series of letters back and forth between the Russian resident in St. Petersburg or the French resident in St. Petersburg and the French foreign minister essentially, and I was, I couldn't make a lot of sense of this, and then I went to a different archive, which I thought had a completely unrelated collection of material, and it turned out that I was able to just, within the same week, make those connections that were nowhere spelled out in any of the stuff that I'd previously read. And I was able to finally reconstruct the whole story of how this guy went from Poland to Russia to Kamchatka to Japan to Taiwan to Paris, to Madagascar eventually. And it was, just the feeling of just elation of just putting, realizing that history is actually is like a seamless web. It's not just like this series of self-enclosed silos was pretty fascinating to me, which I think is one of the beautiful things about doing transnational history, is that you can follow people across borders successfully.
And my final question is, having reached the tail end of this book project, what are your thoughts for future book projects that you hope to pursue?
Yeah, so I'm already starting on my second project, which is, it's going to be a study of Russia and conservatism, in essentially the Russian role in the construction of conservatism in Europe after the French Revolution. Because, Russia is often thought of as a pretty bit player in the whole, even though, the gendarme of Europe thing, whatever, but it turns out that a lot of emigres, of course we know that a lot of French emigres went to Russia, but I don't think we know to what extent the Russian state was deliberately inserting itself into all kinds of ideological and political debates, and sending people out and actively pursuing a policy as a great power. So to me, it's kind of the post-1789 context is the first time that Russia gets a sense of its own global mission as a great power with ambitions beyond its immediate borders. So I'm going to try to follow that both from below through the point of view of various Jesuits and diplomats and so forth, and Knights of Malta in particular, and from above from the point of view of Tsars who were pursuing these policies.
Well, we look forward to it. Thank you, Professor Afinogenov, for your time. We appreciate learning more about your work, and this concludes our discussion.
Thank you very much, Elisha.